Council for the Homeless, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here as part of the Making Home Possible event today. I'm going to share for the next 15 minutes or so a brief discussion of a book that I published with my co-author Clayton Alburn back in March. And the book is called Homelessness as a Housing Problem. I moved to the region, to the Seattle region in 2017 to begin my work at the University of Washington, and I got quickly involved in community conversations and efforts around the issue of housing precarity and homelessness. And I had an observation fairly early on that I was really concerned when I left meetings that people didn't really understand what the root cause of this crisis was, and it continued to grow and grow. Concern grew and grew, and our responses ended up being a little bit scattershot because we weren't centering, in my opinion, what the root cause of this crisis was. And for that reason, I decided I want to write a book to help explain this. I was pleased to be joined by Clayton Alburn on this, who's a fantastic co-author, and we're pleased to have the book published in March of this year. Now, the data in this book comes from the largest cities in the country, but the messages and the takeaways from this are highly relevant to Clark County and Southwest Washington. In fact, what I'm really pleased about is the message of this book is starting to reach out. And so in addition to Clark County, in the next couple months, I'm going to be speaking in Spokane and Sun Valley, Idaho, and Boise, Idaho, Houston, Texas, Columbus, Ohio. Places that are beginning to grow, seeing pressure in the housing market and having growing concerns with homelessness. So while you'll hear me talk about San Francisco and Seattle a lot in this presentation, these messages and the experiences are highly relevant to your own community. So when we talk about homelessness and what's driving this, obviously it has a very emotional response on all of us. No one likes to see someone living on the street. We understand that that's not the way that life is meant to be lived. And so when we count, each jurisdiction in the country counts or creates an estimate of homelessness every January. It's called the point-in-time count. And in addition to counting people, we actually conduct surveys and we ask people, why are you experiencing homelessness? And what we'll see is a range of responses like you see here. This came from the King County point-in-time count in 2019. And you'll see divorce and eviction and drug use and inability to pay rent, and arguments with my roommates, and all these different explanations. And so when these explanations get communicated to the public, it's easy for us to say, boy, it seems like there are a lot of causes to homelessness. And so what complicates things, and what we try to do in this book, is draw a distinction between root causes of homelessness and precipitating events. I fundamentally do not believe that an argument with your roommate is the cause of homelessness. I do firmly believe that in the wrong set of circumstances, being kicked out of your apartment can lead to homelessness. And so what we really need to understand is the context and the circumstances that produce high levels of homelessness. So the easiest way that I've found to explain the difference between a precipitating event and a root cause is this analogy of musical chairs. Imagine a game of 10 friends playing musical chairs. There are 10 chairs and 10 friends. They stand up in a circle and they start walking around, and someone plays music. And when the leader pulls one chair out, stops the music, and then everyone scrambles for a chair. And by definition, someone is left without a chair. And in this case, it was Mike, who had an ankle injury, and he was on crutches. And when the music stopped, he was unable to move quickly and to get one of the chairs that were open. And so if we were to interview Mike at the end of the game and say, Mike, why do you think you lost the game? He would say, I had a bad ankle. And that makes perfect sense. Within the context and the rules of that game, Mike's ankle injury probably did prevent him from finding a chair. But if we take a step back and really think critically about what the cause of his chairlessness was, it was the fact that we didn't have enough chairs. Had we had 10 chairs, Mike would have found a chair. And this is really an analogy that's happening in many communities around the nation right now, which is when housing is scarce, vulnerabilities are accentuated. And it might not be ankle injuries, but it could be mental illness or drug use or poverty. So we know that drug use, mental illness, and poverty do cause homelessness at the individual level. They are key drivers of homelessness. But we also know that these conditions produce homelessness in some locations and not others. And so the purpose of the book is really to understand why is that the case. We know that homelessness rates vary substantially throughout the United States. For example, Seattle, King County has about 5 times the homelessness of Chicago. And so we ask, when you think about Portland and Seattle and San Francisco, do we have large homeless populations there because we have more people with these individual vulnerabilities? That's a perfectly plausible, reasonable explanation for the crisis, but it turns out it's not accurate. Okay? So this is a book about cities, not about people. People-focused research is very, very important, but in this book, we're focusing on cities. We want to understand why there are disproportionate rates of homelessness around the country. And if we can answer that question, it can hopefully help us put an end or put a dent in the problem of homelessness. The thesis of the book is that tight housing markets, where housing is expensive and where housing is scarce, accentuate individual vulnerabilities. And these individual vulnerabilities that we typically focus on, mental illness, drug use, poverty, serve as a sorting mechanism. They identify the people who are most likely to experience homelessness in a place without enough housing. So just to orient you a little bit in terms of the variation in rates of homelessness around the country, some communities count homelessness at the city level, some count at the county level, and when you're comparing, you need to make sure you compare apples to apples, so cities to cities and counties to counties. The purpose of this slide is to show that in both cities and counties, the relationship between high and low jurisdictions in terms of per capita rates of homelessness is about 5-to-1. In cities, it would be New York is about 5 times Indianapolis, and in counties, it's LA County, Santa Clara, King County, and Multnomah County in Portland are about 5 times Hillsborough County. And so the purpose of the book is to explain that variation, and we believe that if we can explain that variation, we can then really focus our attention on ultimately what is driving this crisis. So there are 3 categories of explanations that we pursue. The first one is the individual explanation, which is, I think, the explanations that we typically focus on when we talk about homelessness. I'm not going to get into the statistics today because we don't have time, but the point here is that we're going to show relationships between variables like poverty and rates of homelessness. So in this graph, what you see is all the percentage of people living below the poverty line in each of these jurisdictions around the country. And what's interesting is what we see is, in fact, poverty it does not predict homelessness. In fact, it's the opposite relationship. In places with higher rates of poverty, they actually have lower rates of homelessness. Think Detroit, Michigan. It's the most impoverished city in the country, but it has relatively low rates of homelessness. Homelessness thrives where poverty is relatively low. Seattle and San Francisco are 2 of the most affluent cities in the country and have 2 of the worst homeless populations in the country. So the problem with homelessness in Seattle and San Francisco is not that we have more poor people. In fact, we have fewer poor people. But the consequences of poverty are very different in those locations than elsewhere. This shows the relationship between serious mental illness and homelessness, and what you'll see is that there's 0 relationship here. There are places with more and less mental illness, serious mental illness, but it bears no relationship whatsoever to rates of homelessness. So the problem, and this is state-level data, the problem in California and Oregon and California is not that we have more people experiencing mental illness than anywhere else. It's just the consequences of those conditions are more severe and acute here. The same story with illicit drug use. There are drug users in every community around the country. And in many places, they stay housed, and in other places, they don't. So it's not the number of people who are using drugs, it's the context in which people are using drugs or experiencing mental illness. So the other thing that I hear a lot is there's something unique about the community. Since I live in Seattle, people say there's something unique about Seattle that's causing this crisis. And the first thing I hear is weather. I frequently hear, and I make this joke, that if I had a nickel for every time someone blamed homelessness on the weather, I wouldn't be rich, but I would have a lot more nickels than I have right now. Weather doesn't explain homelessness. It's easy to think of Los Angeles and San Diego and say, well, of course they have homelessness, the weather's warm, but we ignore the fact that Phoenix and Dallas and Miami also have warm weather and don't have problems with homelessness. We also ignore the fact that Boston and New York have 2 of the highest rates of homelessness in the country and are extremely cold in January. So while a convenient explanation, it doesn't hold up when you look at the data. So we can't blame Mother Nature for this crisis. I also frequently hear that generous benefits cause homelessness. It causes people to locate in a certain jurisdiction or location to take advantage of these benefits. This is data on TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program, typically for women and children, that has variation around the country, state by state. You'll see some states are very generous, some are very stingy, but we see no relationship between that and homelessness. We don't see people congregating in states with more generous benefits to take advantage of those benefits. A related story is the idea of people are moving here. I've heard this in Minnesota, I've heard it in Washington, I've heard it in California, I've even heard it in Ohio. Everyone believes they're a magnet for homelessness. The data do not support that argument. There are poor people moving to every jurisdiction in the country, but in fact, where there are more people moving actually have lower rates of homelessness. So places like Baltimore, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Detroit have much higher percentages of low-income migration than do places like San Francisco and Seattle. So it's not that we have this mobility. The mobility explanation doesn't hold up when we look at it. Okay? Generally speaking, homelessness is a homegrown problem. So the final category that we look at are housing market conditions. And this is the first time in a statistical sense that we start to see a much stronger relationship between our variables. Generally speaking, where rents are high, homelessness is high. And this is vacancy rates. When we see vacancy rates are low, we tend to see homelessness being much, much higher. And so while not a perfect prediction, homelessness is a very complex situation. I would never suggest that such a simple explanation could explain all variation. But the point is, if you were to put a blindfold on me and just say, Greg, here's a rental rate and a vacancy rate in a community, I could tell you with a fairly high degree of confidence whether you're going to have a problem with homelessness or not. And that's why jurisdictions and locations like Clark County and Boise and Sun Valley are starting to get concerned because they're seeing rents going up, they're seeing vacancies go down, and they're starting to get worried about the impact on low-income households and the threat of increasing homelessness. So the question then is and I'm not going to get into the math here because that's not what you came to this lunch for, but the point here is that we want to talk about is why do some places have high rents and low vacancies? This is really, really important. And we can certainly think about the demand side for housing, which is population growth. As more people move to a community and they have good jobs, there's more money to chase housing. And generally speaking, that will accelerate home prices. But we also need to think about housing supply. And there are places in the country where it's easy to build housing, generally where you have flat land, meaning no challenging topography, where you have an easy regulatory environment, it's easy to build housing. There are other places like Seattle and San Francisco where it's much more difficult to build housing. And so when you plot cities by population growth and housing supply elasticity, so numbers on the left axis towards 3 would be places where you build a lot of housing. Numbers down towards 0 would be places where you don't build enough housing. So that's the supply side. And the bottom axis is population growth. And so what you'll see is that bottom right quadrant is really the recipe for a housing crisis. Okay? Rapid population growth and not building enough housing. And you'll see cities like Boston and San Francisco and Seattle in that lower right quadrant. And the numbers in parentheses are their vacancy rates. Now look up a little bit to that upper right-hand quadrant, which is the Sun Belt. There you'll see communities that have grown just as fast as Seattle and San Francisco and Boston, but they have built a whole bunch of housing in the process. Okay? And you'll see those vacancy rates are much, much higher there. And so ultimately, and they have some advantages that these other cities have in the sense that their topography, they don't have mountains and water to contend with. But ultimately, cities in that lower right-hand quadrant, and there are many others, need to figure out how are they going to respond to an ever-increasing population by building enough housing. Because if they don't, these rental and vacancy market dynamics will continue. And that's certainly the case in these fast-growing, smaller, mid-sized cities like here in Vancouver and Boise, et cetera. So ultimately, when we think about a response to this issue, people always say, fine, Greg, if you buy and you don't have to buy my argument, but if you do buy my argument, the question then would be, so what? One of the things that's a little challenging about this is when we shift from an individual explanation to homelessness to a structural explanation, it means that we all own this issue. And that's a little bit daunting. And that ultimately we need a lot more investments in housing to make sure we get there. So right now, typically our investments around the country, and I would assume that Clark County is very similar, that many of our investments are operating investments in the sense of providing an emergency response for people experiencing homelessness. And these are life-saving investments, and I'm grateful for these investments because they do provide shelter for folks and they do save lives of getting people off the street. And Council for the Homeless is actively involved in that activity. But let's be very clear that those investments are responses rather than an intervention to end homelessness. Right? We're responding to the crisis as opposed to preventing it. And so communities also need to think about capital investments, and I know that Clark County is thinking about this as well, in the sense that we need to figure out how are we going to construct more housing to ensure that fewer people are falling into homelessness. And the additional housing will also make it far easier to get people out of that emergency response system. And so it's not one or the other, it's both. And for those of you involved in local policy making, there are other levers of government that are really important. And that is, if housing is difficult to construct, we absolutely need to think about ways to make it easier to construct housing where needed. And so I'm a big believer that we should allow the private market to build a whole bunch of housing because we need that housing. That housing alone will not end the crisis of homelessness. We also need public support, nonprofit support to construct housing that's affordable for people with lower incomes. And so while daunting, there is a path to ending this. It will require political will, it will require resources, and it will require the good work of the people in Clark County to put a dent in this growing crisis. What makes this difficult? There are three things. One is building housing is a long-term solution. And we have a homelessness crisis raging in many cities that has an acute and immediate need. And therefore, we need to balance the issue of how do we deal with the current crisis of unsheltered homelessness while providing a long-term solution. We have the question of, should this be a private market or a public market or a public sector issue? And the answer is both. We need all elements of society working together here. And then we have the question if it's going to be the public sector, does it come from Washington, D.C., or does it come from local jurisdictions? And the reality is we could use help at both ends. One of my great frustrations in working on homelessness is when I hear people say, well, we have spent X in our community, X million dollars on homelessness, and the problem only has gotten worse. And then the conclusion that's reached is, then obviously these investments don't work. And I like to change the framing on that a little bit, which is those investments are really, really important. And had we not made those investments, the problem would have been much worse. And the fact that X dollars didn't work means that the scale of the problem has been far greater than our response. That's certainly the case up in Seattle, where I spend my time. Okay? We have made large, big investments, but the scale of the problem is so big that we just need to be thinking about orders of magnitude more involvement and resource commitment given the scale of the problem. And that's daunting, and I understand that, especially if you're an elected leader. So to conclude here, I'm going to wrap up. What I hope you take away from this brief talk and from the book, if you end up reading it, is that we in the United States have typically focused on this issue as one that's individual. And I believe that if we continue to focus on this as an individual issue, it will undermine our efforts to end this issue overall. This is a structural problem, and structural problems require structural solutions. And a structural solution is building a lot more housing that's affordable for people with lower incomes. And so my last point here is that people say, Greg, fine, all these charts, that's all well and good, but how do I know that housing will actually end homelessness? And I'll say, we know that to be true. Because 10 years ago, the United States at the federal level decided that we didn't want people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, our veterans, to experience homelessness. And leaders of both political parties said, we want to put the resources to make sure that these folks don't experience homelessness. And we cut veteran homelessness by 50% in that decade. And how did we do that? We gave them housing. So ultimately, housing does end homelessness. This is a housing problem, and I really appreciate everyone's efforts to provide housing for folks who need it in your community.